Presentation now. It looks like you are, so that's good news. So thank you so much again, Allison, and to the team at MICA for the opportunity to talk about fair housing. It is Fair Housing Month, so that's always something that we look to celebrate. We're hosting a large online conference next week that will provide more detail on a lot of hot topics and feature other speakers. But I am so grateful for the time and attention that you all spend and focus in on fair housing for our residents in Michigan. I'm going to talk about the laws. There's layers to the law, especially if you're new to fair housing. That might be something that takes a little bit of time to get familiar with. So we'll talk about what's happening at the federal, state, and local levels and talk about protections that exist, as well as some proposed protections where we might see some changes. I always like to talk about what's happening in fair housing, share some data about what our Fair Housing Center is experiencing. We are the West Michigan Fair Housing Center. I'm the Director of Education and Outreach at that Fair Housing Center. And we are located in Grand Rapids. We kind of cover Grand Rapids over to Holland and northward. There are other fair housing centers. I will share that information at the end of the presentation. So make sure you do connect to your local fair housing center. There's 5 of us in the state that provide fair housing services for traditional fair housing centers, and then a legal services group that does provide fair housing out in Flint as well. I always share a lot of case examples, and I'm going to talk specifically about some trends that I think could impact the populations that we're all looking to serve and how that correlates with fair housing in a marketplace that doesn't have a lot of affordable housing available, a lot of accessible housing available, quality housing, and then, of course, housing in a pandemic on top of some of the issues that we were already experiencing. So before we dive in and before we do a poll question and ask a little bit about you guys, I want to talk about why this matters and why we're entering into our 41st year of offering fair housing services when we hoped, oftentimes we say we'd like to put ourselves out of business. The fact is, the way that our communities have developed, our neighborhoods have developed, really dictates our quality of life. So where we live impacts how you live. And I think a couple of quotes here from a pretty phenomenal book called Segregation, The Rising Costs for America illustrate that really well. Good jobs, quality education, decent affordable housing, safe neighborhoods, comprehensive health care, access to maintain financial services, and a reliable social safety network are keys to upward economic and social mobility. So if you think about those things, about jobs and education and healthcare, banks, transportation, parks, all the things that we're thinking more closely about as we spend more time at home these days, they're all tied to where we live, and how we have access to that is based on where we live. So really where we live matters greatly in terms of access to opportunity. So we're trying to ensure that there's equal access to housing opportunity because there's so many other opportunities that come tied to our housing in our communities. Further, ensuring these opportunities are available to all residents would empower both traditionally disadvantaged families as well as the broader society as a whole. So hopefully that kind of gives an inkling into what we're thinking. Here's a visual graphic of that for you visual learners. The Equal Housing Opportunity logo here at the center, our home, really tying again into education, healthcare, jobs, wealth building opportunities, and transportation. So Allison, I'm going to bring you back in and ask the audience, a great number of you turning out today. Thank you so much for joining us to answer a quick poll question to let me know, are you new to fair housing? How much experience do we have in the group? Hopefully Allison can pop that poll up for us.
Yep, I am here. Laurel, can you launch it? It's not letting me choose it.
And if it doesn't work out, that's not an issue at all.
She did it.
Ah.
Or I did. I'm
okay,
not sure.
Well,
so
hopefully you all are seeing a poll. I can't see it, but I believe I can see that it's open. So fun with technology. A year later, how good are we? I'm so grateful to Allison and Laurel for their expertise in GoToWebinar.
So the question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, please rate your level of familiarity with housing. It's a single choice option. So it's a scale with 1 starting at I'm new to fair housing, 3 being in the middle, I have some fair housing knowledge, and 5, I know a lot about fair housing. So we'll give folks a 80% of you have voted. We have an active audience. That's
Lightning
great.
quick.
Yeah,
This is a group of activists, you know, so I can't say I'm surprised that they're quick on the boat.
that's a really good point. So I'll give
Always
it,
fun to work with people that are activists.
yes, definitely. Oh, we're up to 88. Great. You guys are doing awesome today. All right, so I am going to close the poll. Hopefully that works.
And then I
And
might have to reshare, is that right?
the answers are supposed to come up automatically. There we go. So 23% of you said I'm new to fair housing. 8% said somewhere in between new and have some knowledge. 43% of you, so the bulk of folks here have some fair housing knowledge. 19% think they know a little bit more than that. And a whopping 7% of you think that you know a lot about fair housing, which is great. So thank you for joining us anyway to see if there's anything else that you can learn today.
That's fantastic. And any of you 7%, you know, feel free to turn your camera on, turn your mic on, and start giving us your fair housing expertise. I love it. I'm happy to share. Okay, so can you see my screen, or
Yep.
is it gone?
You're
It's still
back.
up? Okay.
Yep.
Excellent. All right. Thanks for that information. That's kind of helpful. So we have a mix of a quarter of you who are new. So I'm going to spend a little time detailing the law and making sure that you're following. I do really welcome questions in the chat feature, or I believe there's a Q&A feature as well. So feel free to do that. And if you're not able to participate in typing, or that's not a good option for you, please do let us know, and we'll try to get to your question in another way. So fair housing laws are layered. They've been in place for a number of years. It's been a long journey, and we have a long way to go. The point of fair housing law is what we originally called open housing in the days when Dr. King and the members of the civil rights movement that you might be more familiar with were working on housing choice. Has been incremental progress through the years. Unfortunately, because it is April, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that yesterday was the 53rd anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act on April 11th. And unfortunately, it took the tragic events of April 4th, the assassination of Dr. King, to push Congress to pass the next civil rights laws that included the housing section that we have here today. Fair housing was not originally expected to be included in this civil rights bill. It was fought against quite vigorously by opponents of fair housing. And I think it took really the tone of the nation, the hurt of the nation, the tragedy of the assassination of Dr. King, to where they felt like they didn't have any other choice but to move forward and pass our first Fair Housing Act in 1968. It gave us a short list of protected classes, and it was intentionally toothless, I would say. So it took us about 20 more years to pass a second Fair Housing Act, the Fair Housing Act amendments, that added protected classes, but also gave some enforcement mechanisms to fair housing cases. So some opportunities for people to actually meaningfully attempt to get good case law and better clarity on housing opportunity. So it's important to know that there's these layers of laws, and there's these groups of protected folks. It can change based on the geography that you serve. So one of the reasons, again, I urge you to connect with your local fair housing center is to find out if you have any local fair housing laws. There's over 45 cities in the state of Michigan, or municipalities in the state of Michigan, that have passed local fair housing ordinances. Sometimes they just basically restate what exists at the federal level, or what's already in state law. But a lot of them add to the list of protections. So that's a little bit of homework I encourage you to do, especially if you're new to fair housing. I do maintain, I used to be a paper person. Now in the pandemic, I'm much less paper-based, as I imagine some of you are also. I have a drawer full, and we have links on our website of fair housing ordinances in our service area, but I also try to keep track across the state. So feel free to reach out to me. It prohibits discrimination not only in rentals, but also in sales, lending, and even insurance. We've had a significant trend of properties being denied insurance policies or being charged more because they rent to, for example, people who have Section 8 or housing choice vouchers. So if this is something that you're encountering with some of the partners that you work with, some of the housing providers that do accept vouchers, if they're letting you know that this is something they've been dropped from their insurance company, for example, that's something a provider notified me about recently, or their price is going up because of who they're housing. That is potentially a fair housing violation, and I encourage you to reach out to a local center to explore that. So it covers a variety of different transactions, and these are the groups that are protected. So on the federal side here, we have race, color, national origin, and religion. Those have been in place since the late 60s and part of that original Fair Housing Act. We added gender in the 70s, disability status, and familial status in 1988 when we passed the amendments, and also had some enforcement ability. Some of you will work with people that are HUD providers of housing, so they're funded by HUD or operated by HUD. They are subject to the equal access rule. So there's federal guidance for those federally funded programs that further prohibits discrimination based on marital status, sexual orientation, and gender identity. That's been in place since I think 2012 now. Here in the state of Michigan, we have marital status and age protections. And we also have included gender in a very broadly defined way here in Michigan since 2018, the spring of 2018. So I want to highlight that the gender definition, sexual orientation and gender identity has been determined to be covered under existing gender protections that have been in place federally and here in Michigan since the 70s, because they're elements of gender. So the case law and guidance from the federal government is saying these are things that are covered under those existing protections.
Well,
so
we have a hand up, Liz. Sorry.
Oh, sure. Okay, sorry, I don't see that. So is there a typed question or can you?
I'm going to unmute Steve because I'm assuming he was hoping to ask the question.
Great.
So, oh, it looks like he's self-muted. Steve, are you able to ask the question? Oh, he put his hand down. So it must have been an accident. So sorry to call you out, Steve.
No problem. That's helpful to know that people have that option, and please feel free to jump back in anytime. So as I was saying, we've been working on equal housing opportunity for a long time. So you might have been familiar already with the history of the 1960s civil rights movement and the passage of the Fair Housing Act at that point in time. We have to go back 100 years in history as part of Reconstruction after the end of the war, where we really saw the first laws put in place that were meant to provide equal opportunity regardless of race in terms of access to real property at the time. So it expanded that opportunity essentially at the time for men only, regardless of their race, to be able to purchase and hold real property and to be treated equally in that pursuit. So, you know, we've been having this conversation and making these attempts for quite some time. As I said, we added gender in the 70s, and these are now the protections that are interpreted to include sexual orientation and gender identity. 1988, I think for a lot of us, it's not that long ago. So I think we do see a lot of issues with discrimination against families with children. Familial status means families under the age, with children under the age of 18. Disability status covers physical or mental disabilities. I'll talk more about both of these in our trends section. But these protections aren't very old. So we do see a lot of policy that's been in place for a long time that doesn't provide equal treatment or equal opportunity to these two particular protected classes. So very recently, February 11th, the current administration, based on an employment case decision, expanded the gender protections. Pardon me, my spring allergies. That's how you know it's really spring. Expanded the protections available, redefining gender to include sexual orientation and gender identity just in February of this year. It was solidified in a memo from the HUD secretary. Warden is her last name. So we've got that piece of guidance now for the first time that allows people regardless of how the housing is funded, regardless of where the housing is located in the country. If somebody is experiencing a barrier to their housing because of sexual orientation or gender identity or both, they are protected as of February 11th this year across the country. So that's a significant expansion. As I said, we in Michigan had that in place, that enforcement opportunity in place since May of 2018. But now we have this nationwide protection for those populations. So Michigan was very progressive early on. 1976 added their own layer of law here where we have marital status protections and age protections. So whether or not you're married, you are protected under ELCRA, regardless of your age, with the exception of senior communities. There's 2 age limits that are legally allowed under Housing for Older Persons Act. You've seen properties that are 55 and older and 62 and older. Those are really the only legal age restrictions that are allowed and compatible with our state law here that otherwise prohibits housing discrimination. We do see people who have a bias against housing people in their 20s or certain genders of people that are younger, things along those lines. And yes, you will have a subset of slides available. I typically don't send out any bad examples, or I don't send things out that I don't have permission to disseminate, but you'll have a lot of this information to refer back to, absolutely. So it's been proposed to officially add sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes under Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act. These have been brought forward as possible protections multiple times, but they have been reintroduced. So it's a current proposed expansion. There's another bill that is proposing that race be further defined to be inclusive of traits historically associated with race regarding hair texture and protective hairstyles. So hairstyles such as braids, locks, and twists. So these are both bills that have been brought forward that may move forward and become part of the protections under Elliott-Larsen. We shall see.
We do have another question, Liz.
Yeah, great.
Somebody is asking, can private landlords say they only want to rent to seniors?
Can private landlords only want to say they rent? It depends on how the housing is set up. I would generally say probably not, but I would need a little bit more information. I was on a panel last week for Holland, and I was on the panel with a judge, and we were laughing because we've done this before, and we say typically we are leading on the answer, it depends a lot in our responses. So I think I need to know a little bit more about what was happening and if the housing was being offered in compliance with HOPA. So the program would have to operate with the intent to house seniors. The standards are pretty minimal, and I'm not sure that that's something that a private landlord could exclusively offer. So I'd really want to talk a little bit more about that with that individual. But I definitely think that's worth evaluating to see if they would be able to do so. Great question.
We have another hand up, so it's Chanel. I'm gonna unmute you if you would like to ask your question.
That was an accident.
Oh, all right.
Hi,
Well,
Chanel, no
you.
worries.
Thank you for joining us today. All right, back to you, Liz.
It relieves me that I'm not the only one who's not as versed in GoToWebinar, so I appreciate you guys hanging in there with us on this technology. So local protections can vary, literally, city to city, crossing boundary line to boundary line. So there's a number of communities that have already adopted protections regarding sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. It depends on when these laws were passed and how they define those groups. The language has certainly changed over time. We also see a lot of conversation and only a limited number of communities that encourage source of income protections within their city limits. So basically, if it's lawful and verifiable income within the city limits, it should be counted towards household income to see if the individual qualifies for the housing available. And this is a big area certainly for voucher holders who are looking to find housing providers that will participate with them in the voucher program. And for example, Grand Rapids, Kentwood, Wyoming, and Holland, I have more experience in those areas with those communities. They've had source of income protections for some time for those city limits. This is also something that Micah can speak to, and a number of community groups are really looking at what would happen if this were a statewide protection. And I think that would be really interesting because people would really have choice then with their voucher to take that voucher to whatever housing opportunity they feel meets their needs or their family needs best. Right now, there's really not an enforcement mechanism outside of those communities where those protections exist to encourage that housing provider to count all lawful and verifiable income. This could also include alimony or really anything that's non-traditional non-employment is kind of what we hear. We have a lot of housing providers who try to rent to people who are employed only, or they've turned away people that have subsidies with statements like, well, I can't garnish that, so I'm not going to rent to you. So that assumption that somebody is not going to make payments before they're even given the opportunity to pursue the housing, that denial comes in. So I think this is a really interesting conversation, and there's been a lot of advocacy and education about this opportunity. So I encourage you to kind of look for that type of information or connect with Mike or others in the Homeless Coalition networks that are talking about this opportunity. We see Height and Weight, we see Educational Association in places like East Lansing, where there's a lot of student populations, Ann Arbor. But I've seen protections that include HIV status or pregnancy, ancestry, political orientation protected in the capital. That may not surprise you. So they can really change quite a bit depending on where you are located. So it's important to be informed as to what laws exist so that we can help with that type of awareness and enforcement across the state.
We have a lot of questions, Liz.
Well, I think I know what it's about, and that's probably a good time to pause and take some.
Okay, so we have one question that says, I know that often it won't be explicitly stated that gender identity and sexual orientation is the reason for denying housing. How do we navigate if a housing provider claims another reason for denying housing, but it's pretty clear that it's due to identity?
That's a great question. And so from a fair housing perspective, if we have the ability or the opportunity, what we would like to do is conduct something that we call testing. So we have trained volunteers that represent all of the protected classes that are kind of on standby. So when we receive allegations like this, or we suspect that a form of discrimination is occurring, we send out, and I use the language send out, we don't go out in person right now, but someday we'll get back to that. So we would inquire, call, email, etc., non-contact testing, non-in-person testing, I should say. We would inquire about housing opportunities that provider may have available, whether it's that one that they're continuing to list after they denied someone, or maybe they operate other housing. So the challenge is, what evidence can a fair housing center provide to show that this pattern or practice exists? And I think the point that it can be very hard to uncover is right on the nose. Testing really does help with some of that evaluation, because we have two comparably qualified individuals. The only variable is the protected class. So if there's a suspected pattern of sexual orientation discrimination, we would send out a couple who would identify themselves as gay and a couple who would identify themselves as straight, and have them inquire about that housing opportunity. They would be comparably qualified. So really the only element that would impact the decision is that protected class. So that's one mechanism that we have to establish differences in treatment based on protected class. People have the right to file complaints with HUD, the Department of Civil Rights, the courts, with a fair housing center. They can choose to move towards that enforcement process fairly quickly if they so choose. If we have the ability and the time, we would do some testing, but each case and each process is unique. When we have a client, they really drive that process.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a follow-up to the seniors. This person saying that they saw advertisement that the place is discounting towards seniors. So I guess a reduced rent.
Yeah, so that should be evaluated as potentially discriminatory, but again, seniors have that housing for older protections. Sorry, I said that wrong. HOPA, housing for older adults. it depends on how it's being operated as to whether we would be able to prove that that's discriminatory. Because I'm not a senior, for example, I don't have that protection. So I think I need to know a little bit more about that, but I think it bears an evaluation to see if that would be a red flag under fair housing, for sure, under age protections. The question is always, you know, who gets left out, and is that a protected group? So the potential is there, I think, without knowing a lot more, or maybe the justification for that discount. I'd like to know more. Absolutely.
Okay, so we have someone asking how, if you can explain a little more how senior-only places are permitted. So I'm assuming they mean, you know, like senior buildings. How is
Yep,
that?
the 55 and older and the 62 and
Yep.
older. Sure. The Housing for Older Persons Act, it came out of kind of the understanding that seniors may not want to live with younger individuals or families with children anymore, or they also might need, it might be more affordable and more accessible for them to have housing that's unique to that population because of the healthcare needs. So there's kind of multiple layers of thinking behind meeting the needs of housing and providing it exclusively for seniors. But it's a very minimal set of standards for a property to qualify to be considered senior housing, as long as they use the correct age limits. They do age verification, they keep records, and they operate with the intent to house seniors. So it's pretty broad, and it is one of the growing areas where anytime we've seen slumps in housing development, we don't see a slowdown really in senior housing development, because we have our baby boomers and many people thinking about, okay, where am I going to age in place? What am I going to need? So there's kind of that protection for that population, and it does rub up against a little bit protection for families with children and the age protections here in Michigan, but it's a federal law, so it's going to trump, you know, and it's been kind of designed to the work around essentially and allow for those exemptions, especially if it's housing that offers a continuum of care. You know, it may start with independent living, but then graduate to assisted living. It kind of grows as the needs of the individual change. So I'm happy to provide that individual with more information directly about housing for older persons, or you can visit our website. We have a publications page that has a lot of information and HUD guidance by kind of subtopic. So that's a great question.
Okay. Well, we have a lot, so I'm just going to ask a couple more right now, and then we'll move on, and we'll have to just email out the rest.
Yep.
Someone is asking if these rules also apply to government funding housing programs like transitional housing. Some of these programs have gender and age requirements for residents. Is that okay?
You know, it depends. So if they're offering programs that are only available to certain populations, you know, we certainly obviously have homeless preferences, veteran preferences, persons with disabilities preferences. Some of those preferences are allowed under both HUD or fair housing, you know, regulations. But we do see a lot of very targeted programs that aren't aware of fair housing. And I know that a lot of them come from a place of, this is an unhoused population, we're going to try to meet this need. So again, it really does depend on which laws cover that place where the community is located, and if they have, you know, structured the program in a way that does not violate fair housing laws. You know, it's something that I hate to say it again, but it does depend, you know. So unfortunately, we see a lot of grassroots programs come out of communities with like really well-intentioned folks seeking to serve a need that they believe they've identified, and they have no awareness of fair housing. So we really try to work with those programs, hopefully before they're up and running, to educate them so that they don't build a program or offer housing that leaves a risk of, you know, being challenged with a fair housing complaint. Absolutely.
Okay, we're going to let you continue with your presentation for a little bit.
Okay.
So hopefully so we can get
Move
through
forward
it.
and then we'll pause.
Yep.
You know, I love the questions, so I appreciate that. So I believe I've really talked about the source of income protections. They can vary based on how they're defined by community, but generally it's legal and verifiable income that should be counted as such. As I mentioned, there is a conversation about adding this to the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act. There's also been conversations about maybe adding it to tenant landlord law here in Michigan. But we have seen issues with insurance companies dropping properties or housing providers or charging them more because they accept Section 8 or housing choice vouchers. We see this with properties that house people with disabilities, which is also a violation, and sometimes we'll hear about it for students, which could be a violation as well for age protections. So again, I really encourage you to do the homework a little bit and get to know what fair housing laws exist in the areas where you are providing your services. Check with your local fair housing centers, check with the government body, and then I've offered a couple of sites here that have free code libraries essentially online. And again, these are in the handout that you'll get. Or also you can click on it, I believe, on the little floating menu and download it. So just to kind of reiterate, there are a number of us providing fair housing services, and this is kind of the breakdown of who we are and where we are. Generally, the UP in the northwest side of the upper part of the mitten, so to speak, does come to our Fair Housing Center. But honestly, we welcome you to reach out and we will connect you if we have a group that we know you should be connected with. Most housing, including empty lots, can be, if it's intended to be residential, can be covered by fair housing laws. So apartments, condos, homeowners associations, they don't like to believe that they're covered by fair housing, but they are. Homes that are being built, manufactured homes, rooming houses, shelters, as long as there's an expectation that people can leave their belongings and return is typically one of the evaluations that we do of, you know, is this shelter considered a dwelling under law? That's typically something we have to do on a case-by-case basis based on how the shelter operates. College residence halls, housing co-ops, public housing authorities, housing commissions, government-run housing, those are all covered under fair housing. Our mission as a nonprofit, and as Allison kindly said, we don't have attorneys on staff. I'm not an attorney, I can't give legal advice. But what we are dedicated to is providing education about fair housing to all parties, with the hope that if we do so, we will hopefully prevent housing discrimination from occurring, address it when it is discovered, and try to really promote that inclusive approach to housing everyone in our communities across our service area. So we do it with kind of a two-armed approach. We have kind of the investigation, advocacy, enforcement side, and then again, the education and outreach and kind of getting the information out to everyone side. So a two-armed approach to fair housing. And I've talked a little bit already about how we believe where you live impacts directly how you live. So I'll move forward there. People like to kind of hear about what's happening in terms of what types of complaints are actually being filed. Heavily at the national level, it has skewed towards disability-based complaints for over 10 years now. It's followed by discrimination based on race. We also see familial status and sex-based discrimination coming up high. There's been an uptick in national origin discrimination. That is where someone is from, their ethnicity. That 10.79%, that other, is a fairly new category because so many states and local communities are adding fair housing protections. The national office is really trying to track that. I do want to highlight, especially because you are working with populations that might have some subpopulations that are vulnerable, that we are seeing an uptick in sex-based discrimination, specifically related to sexual harassment. And these numbers were pre-pandemic, so we fully expect that this is you know, something that unfortunately we will hear about too late or long after it's occurred. But sexual harassment is prohibited very strongly in housing, and I really urge you to reach out to a local fair housing center to report that or connect somebody who's experiencing that to us. Most of the complaints nationally are rental, but we do see sales, lending, insurance, harassment, advertising, homeowners associations, and all other types of complaints. So it's not just rental transactions. I do want to highlight that a lot of renters, just under 40% of renters nationally, work in industries that are directly vulnerable under the pandemic ripple effects. You know, people working in food and accommodations, construction, entertainment, retail, and other services like that you know, have heavily been economically impacted, are tied to these populations that do rent. And there's strong correlations of percentages of Latinos, Blacks, Asians, and of course, white workers. We've had really strong impacts, but predominantly impacting some communities of color a little bit harder. Within our West Michigan service area, we had 184 allegations filed with our Fair Housing Center, heavily skewing also towards disability-based violations. This is our 6th year in a row here in West Michigan where that has been our #1 issue. Prior to that, we saw a 7-year trend relating to the foreclosure crisis where discrimination against families with children was the most commonly reported issue for our center. Prior to that, all the way back to when we opened in 1980, race or skin color or skin color type complaints were the #1 basis of complaint for a huge portion of our history. As I said, we are also seeing an uptick in gender-based complaints. A lot of those are sexual harassment, but it can also be just a housing provider who's saying things like, well, I've had trouble with the last few male renters I've had, so I'm not going to take a chance on you. Or I don't want to rent to women because they complain too much and they won't fix things themselves. Well, that's not their responsibility under a good lease. So we do see some of those assumptions kind of controlling access to housing. Only a handful of source of income complaints that can jump up and down based on the year. But those are difficult, and the local protections tend to not be very strong for those enforcement processes. We also are heavily rental in our caseload, but we also saw a significant chunk of a failure to accommodate people with disabilities, whether it's a physical or mental disability. Even during the pandemic, we saw sales discrimination, harassment, mortgage and advertising discrimination, and a failure to modify for people with disabilities. Those are the structural changes like ramps and grab bars. The accommodations are failure to adapt really policy or adapt services, procedures in order to meet the needs of a person with a disability, like accepting rent a few days late because the disability income comes after rent is due, or assigning an accessible parking spot dedicated to the use of that particular individual so that they can come and go safely from their home. Assistance animals also fall under accommodations. So there's all sorts of things that housing providers might need to adapt in order to accommodate people with disabilities. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But you're probably catching on that difference in treatment is the most critical concept to consider under fair housing. Who is being treated fairly, who might be left out? Is there any implication where, intended or not, a protected class is either being left behind or benefiting? It's equal treatment across the board. So I think a lot of homeless providers hear that response of, well, I can't work with you because fair housing won't let me. And we like the opportunity to do a little education and push back on that and say, what exactly is happening here? Is there an opportunity where, as a homeless person, they can be prioritized? Homelessness is not a protected class. So we like to be involved in those conversations when we can. But we really encourage equal treatment unless, of course, there's the need to do more as required by law for people with disabilities. Some signs that might have been something you've heard or been told about of housing discrimination. Has somebody been told they have too many people or too many children to fit, or just that they don't want that many people or children in a property? That might be a reasonable occupancy violation. I've talked about sexual harassment, denial of a permission to have a ramp installed or built, denial of a live-in aid or an emotional support animal. Those are accommodations for people with disabilities. A landlord who will not bend from a no felonies policy. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Or somebody who simply won't ever consider renting to families with children, especially if they have upper floor units available. It's not the housing provider's decision to limit those units or limit the families to first floor units.
So I have two questions I want to ask that came in. One
Sure.
is, are victims of or survivors of domestic violence a protected class in Michigan?
They are not. Pre-pandemic, there was a bill proposing protections for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking. I might be missing another element, but that bill was pre-pandemic and went to committee and did not advance. So I imagine we would see that reintroduced at some point as the legislature's attention turns away from the pandemic. Of course, that's a bit of a moving target here in Michigan with the way our numbers are skewing. But it is not right now unless there's federal funding at a property. There's some Violence Against Women Act protections, but it's very limited, especially in the private market.
Okay, thank you. And then one more, someone's asking if chronic homelessness, which one of the criterion is that you have a disability, is that a protected class?
No, chronic homelessness is not protected. Just having a disability, as long as it meets the standards of what the Fair Housing Act defines having a disability as, is protected. So
Okay.
hopefully that differentiation is important. Okay. So, you know, there's opportunities for all kinds of differences. It becomes a fair housing issue when the differences directly impact or directly address or leave behind one of these groups that's protected. So you can probably see by now why I was really kind of hammering it's important to know the protections so that you have the connection that, okay, this is a fair housing issue and I do need to think about it or maybe look for resources or some advocacy here. I think we've really talked about a lot of these, except for maybe, you know, we do see discriminatory maintenance. You know, we're not going to take care of that property because there's so many kids there. So we'll just do Band-Aid fixes. Well, that's not okay. Or we're not really going to care for that property because, you know, we've got a lot of men living there and they can do it themselves. Well, again, that's not their responsibility and that's gender discrimination. So anything that really strikes you as questionable, I encourage you to reach out to us or a local fair housing center to evaluate it for discriminatory impacts. I also really see a lot of unnecessary information asked of applicants. You know, I've heard rumors of a 100-page application at a senior housing community. I really don't ever necessarily want to see that form because I can only imagine how much information they shouldn't be asking. They are asking. So it really should focus on their eligibility as a tenant and their ability to afford the housing. Anything that really goes beyond and is diving into the protected classes without really a business justification or maybe a occupancy consideration. You know, they can't overhouse, you know, you can't put 8 people in a 2-bedroom unless it's a massive unit with a huge floor plan. So, you know, they really need to only be asking questions that are applicable in the application stage and really not go above and beyond and get into the weeds of details about protected class information. Sometimes there's information that should be collected after they've been accepted. You know, if you want to celebrate birthdays or anniversaries or know a faith-based affiliation for an older adult in case they want to have, you know, connections should their health fail with a faith-based member, that's, you know, after is appropriate, certainly not in the application stage. Unfortunately, as I said, I've talked about the sexual harassment, but we also have other kinds of harassment kind of upticking. Certainly doesn't surprise those of you who have heard about general attacks on Asian residents across the country. We've had a significant trend of hate crimes identified by the FBI as largely occurring at residences in or near homes. And this might be a fair housing issue, especially if the goal is to push someone out of housing or let them know they're not welcome to pursue that housing opportunity. For example, you may have seen some news coverage last summer of a Black tenant who came home and found that somebody had written "No Blacks Allow" on his front door. After that messaging was removed, somebody returned and wrote KKK and WLM on the door. So, you know, that of course is very concerning from a safety standpoint of should I continue to live here? How do I continue to live here? How do I feel safe? Can we catch this person? Unfortunately, we have not been able to figure out, you know, the perpetrator here, but they worked with the city and us and the police. And it's something that has to be challenged. The housing provider must address these sorts of situations. And again, these individuals should be connected with a fair housing center to help educate the building and the other residents that this is unacceptable. Here's an example from Indiana, actually, of a landlord who's trying to transition the tenant payment into a sexual relationship. And she very bravely continued to ask him to clarify what exactly he was asking for. Because she realized fairly quickly that, he was starting to pressure her for a sexual relationship that was unwanted. So other pandemic trends that we're concerned about are, again, who gets the benefit of the doubt? If anybody is being given grace to pay rent late or more time to catch up, that should be available to everyone, regardless of protected class. We've seen a lot of back and forth over the eviction relief. Certainly the CDC eviction has been extended through the end of June, but what's going to happen come July? And again, we need to make sure that our housing providers, from the fair housing perspective, are providing equal treatment, even in terms of how things are rapidly changing as a result of the pandemic. We also have some concerns about people with disabilities maybe being denied access to the services or caregivers or some of the aids that they may need. We were contacted early on, and really anytime there's a potential restriction of movement, housing providers are looking to protect their residents and staff, but they have to acknowledge that you cannot ban a caregiver for a person with a disability because you could significantly endanger their health and their well-being by doing so. So that's something that we've worked to provide some awareness of. So I mentioned the definition of disability under law earlier. Here we have it. So it's very broadly defined. I think this is why we do see a lot of misunderstanding or confusion. It's very strange to have to ask somebody to label themselves legally a person with a disability, but they do need to meet these thresholds in order to have the law apply to them to have these protections. So physical or mental impairments that substantially limit one or more major life activities, someone who could be regarded to have a disability or has a record of having a disability and is treated, as such in a negative way. There's a list of examples here. It's not all inclusive. Again, it's really a broad definition. The major life activity element also should be broadly construed. So essentially somebody has an impairment of some kind that changes how they see, hear, walk, breathe, perform tasks, take care of themselves, work, conduct their social lives, learn, speak, etc. So this is the threshold that triggers that protection. We often see a flat out refusal to work with people with disabilities, or because they have a member of the family unit or household with a disability, extra fees, higher deposits, higher rent, that discouragement to make it unaffordable. If it's because of the disability and we can prove as such, that's a fair housing violation. We see a lot of medical history and medical information requested. And if you're not entering into housing that also provides medical care, you do not have to provide that information. So this is something that we've seen some big cases come out of different states across the country where independent living communities and others are asking medical questions when they are purely a housing provider. If that's all they offer, they don't have the right to have any health-related information. So I think that's really an important piece to be aware of. And as I mentioned, modifications and accommodations are requests that can be made. They have to be a person with a disability as defined by law and have a disability-related need for these changes. Physical changes, swapping out the doorknobs, changing the kitchen work surfaces, swapping out the stove or oven for something with front panel controls. All sorts of things might be available that makes the home much more user-friendly and livable for that individual. Generally, these are made at the expense of the person making the request unless the housing is federally funded. We have a ton of information about these types of requests, guidebooks from your perspective as advocates, guidebooks for housing providers on how to walk through these processes available on our website. Here's examples of steps taken out and a 0-step entrance put in, taking away a doorknob on the 101 door and putting in a very small lip ramp there that made a huge difference in day-to-day access and quality of life for that individual who largely used a wheelchair to come and go from his apartment.
So we have one question I wanted to stick in there. We only have 10 minutes left. I know you said that you could stay an extra 5, but just wanted to be mindful. Sorry, everyone. Someone is asking if you can talk a little bit about the remedies available to someone experiencing a fair housing violation. What's the incentive for someone to come forward?
I'll talk about the how in a moment, but the incentive to come forward is a really great question. I appreciate you asking that. It's a hard thing to ask somebody to do, especially if they are moving or looking to move. It's one of the most stressful things besides death and divorce that we experience. Honestly, it's typically up there in the top 5. So adding a slow civil rights-based process can be asking a lot. However, with our Fair Housing Center, what we really strive to do is make that person whole to the best of our ability, and how they define that, whether that could be financial damages, access to the housing if they still want to pursue that opportunity. If it's still available and they want to live there, we work to make that happen. Stopping the practice, changing the policy. What can we do to make sure this does not happen again? And we really encourage training. Doesn't have to be with us, but please learn fair housing law so this doesn't happen again. So we really do try to take it from the perspective of, not only will it help address the situation that this particular individual is facing, but hopefully it will open the door for others to follow. One of the things that we track is the number of units or beds that we open up as a result of our work. And I'm really proud to say that we've opened tens of thousands of units to Housing Choice, or freed them from discriminatory barriers because of our clients and because of partners like you who identify issues that we can tackle without actually having a client. If it's brought to our attention, and all of you are more likely to hear or experience a barrier first, before we are. So we really rely on our partners out there kind of listening with your fair housing antenna to bring these sorts of things to our attention. Even if you're not sure, that's our job. We will suss out if we see a fair housing violation or if it needs to be tested to determine what really is happening. But we need lots of ears and feet on the ground to help us do that identification. So we can try to either make that client whole to the best of our ability, or change that pattern or practice out of education, and the Fair Housing Center pushing that change forward without a client. So you can report discrimination to our center anonymously. I cannot promise that for the other centers, but you can contact us. You can contact me directly, and I'll take it as an anonymous piece of information, scrub your information, and share it with our enforcement team for follow-up. So I really rely on all of you and your experience in helping people access systems to share what you see as a potential barrier. See if it's a fair housing issue so we can tackle it. That's a really great question. So I've talked about accommodations examples here, but a couple more. Overnight caregivers in places that prohibit overnight guests, for example. There's a real difference between a guest and a caregiver, and we can do that education to help open that opportunity up. Assistance animals is something we spend a lot of time on, and I encourage you to check out our new resource guide to see if it's something that could be beneficial for somebody that you're working with. Parking assignments, swapping of rental due dates. If somebody has a change in their medical condition or their health to the point where they literally cannot take advantage of most of what the housing offers, or they literally can't use their bathroom or come and go, if they're homebound because of a disability, that housing does not work for them anymore. So we can work towards getting them released from the lease penalty free if they can't utilize that housing anymore. Transfers to different floors and units, there's all sorts of possible accommodations. So again, I've got some great sample letters, sample policies, resources, HUD guidance, our guidance based off of HUD guidance, available to all of you and to your clients and the folks you serve. A little bit of more information, examples of discrimination against families with children. We've had all kinds of cases where the housing application is denied simply when the presence of a child or children is revealed, or when somebody is, visibly pregnant, and housing providers will, shut that process down. Limiting where they can go or how they can use the housing facilities that they're paying for because there are children. Charging extra fees per child is a huge red flag. A higher security deposit is against fair housing law and landlord-tenant law. Occupancy is probably our biggest issue, but even saying, well, we allow children over 16, but none under, or we put you all in this building, those are all red flags. The general rule of thumb, especially those of you who said you're more familiar with fair housing, you might have heard 2 people per bedroom a lot. And that has been the standard, but it no longer applies in the way that we build now. If you think about more modern floor plans with open kitchen living room designs, extra rooms in the basement, loft space, studio space. We really have changed how our homes look. And so 2 people per bedroom doesn't work as the occupancy standard anymore. So if that's something you're encountering, we encourage you to look at local code, see what the local code would allow for that particular layout of that home or that apartment unit, and do the calculations based on the individual layouts to make sure how many people can legally and safely live there. We don't want to overhouse people in terms of creating a danger that way. But we also don't want to turn families or multi-generational families, families with multiple kids, foster kids, but whatever the case may be. We don't want to turn them away on the falsehood that there's too many people when legally they could fit. So that's something that we see quite often for families with children to kind of have to try to address. So we really encourage housing providers to know that and apply that equally across the board. It also could be a red flag when there's fees per person that there's no business justification for. We had a housing provider charging $50 more per child per month, and a mom with 3 children was paying $150 more. The label for it was utilities, but she was paying all utilities except water, and there was no way the water bills were that high. So there's things that can seem neutral, but the impact is discriminatory. So we've got a whole guidebook on that as well for housing providers, but also for advocates to kind of help calculate and better understand occupancy in terms of housing people according to local code. We do see national origin discrimination. Citizenship is not protected, but we do really want to be aware that if a housing provider is asking about national origin or citizenship status, we want to know why, and then who are they asking? Are they only asking people with accents or dark skin, or are they asking it of everybody? So typically these are just triggers to ask more, find out more, investigate more. Certainly, of course, we're very aware of the discrimination that Asians and Asian Americans are experiencing right now. So if that's something you're encountering, especially in the housing search, that should go to a fair housing center. Every person in the United States is protected by the Fair Housing Act. It is often very difficult to convince this population that they do have rights. So we don't hear a lot of these types of complaints, but immigration status does not affect fair housing protection. So it's unlawful for a housing provider to treat them differently because of their immigration status. So limiting or not allowing legal types of identification, flat out refusing to rent, charging higher amounts, those sorts of things could be violations. Again, if it's due to that protected class, which would be national origin here. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, we've seen an uptick in harassment, so threatening to report or call the police or immigration authorities, comments, regarding the ability to deport groups or telling them to go back home, slurs, threats, racial or ethnic slurs, limiting things that come with the rent or that they're paying for, discouraging them from fully using the amenities that they pay for that come with the housing. We see it in a lot of different ways. So I know I'm very close. Oh, it's 2 o'clock. So I'm going to skip the data here and just talk about criminal records. There is guidance from HUD for private housing providers. Public housing authorities have their own separate set of guidance. This is specific to private housing providers. We encourage them to focus on resident safety and property because that is what the HUD guidance says we should do. It doesn't tell us how screening should look or what the steps are, but it does give us a few takeaways. Housing providers should not use arrests that have not resulted in convictions. They should look at convictions only, verified information. Blanket bans and prohibitions no longer can be defended as non-discriminatory. And we're starting to see some big cases come out of this guidance. I believe this came out in 2015, and it takes a while for these pieces to be transitioned into case law, but that's what we're starting to see. So what should be focused on? Common sense, the nature and severity of the conviction or convictions, and how long ago it occurred. Again, it doesn't give us a hard set of parameters for this, but this is guidance that we can lean on when we find policies that are overbearing, based on stereotypes, don't have detail, don't allow for someone to appeal, for example. Any policy that is developed should be applied equally across the board, regardless of protected class. And it does specifically say that housing providers can exclude people who have been convicted of illegal drug manufacturing or distribution. So they've been convicted, not arrested, but convicted of making or selling controlled substances. So it's not possession, it's not arrest, and it's very specific there. So just a couple of notes on that. We take complaints by phone, email, letter. Right now, we're not doing in person. Our services are free. We accept anonymous complaints. We can work with the clients, and they really steer the process. They get to decide, especially if they're going to maintain their housing, like we're working on a reasonable accommodation. We really let them steer the process on what works best for them. We encourage you to contact our intake specialist or our enforcement coordinator. That's George and Becky, if you're in our West Michigan service area. And give us as much information as you possibly have. The more we have, the better we can react, and especially timeliness is helpful, of course, as well. And document everything. As soon as you're not sure of any circumstance that's coming across your desk, be sure to document, and encourage your clients to document everything as well. Maintain a set of their own records. They have all kinds of options. They can litigate in federal or state court. Some cases can go to the Department of Justice, like our larger sexual harassment cases go there. People can file administratively, which is essentially a paperwork-based process with HUD or the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, or if it's a local fair housing ordinance that is providing the protection, we would go to the municipality and use their process to file a complaint. Mediation is also an option. But housing discrimination is very difficult to experience and very personal. So oftentimes people don't really choose mediation, but we offer it and would bring in professionals to do that. Circling back to kind of what's the incentive, what can we do? If they still want to live there, if the housing's still available, we try to make that happen. We are not an enforcement authority, but our partners, these other venues, which their rights are used to exercise, have the ability to do that. We really emphasize training, policy changes, and if warranted, then the victim may receive compensation as well. So I really encourage you to reach out if you feel like you're working with somebody who's experiencing fair housing issues. We've got our little list here. Remember, record, report, document. Connect with your local fair housing groups. I really strongly encourage you to take a moment to do that. Hopefully these links will be clickable in the PDF. And I have a couple of minutes for questions. So I will, you can take my screen away if you'd like, Allison, so I can just talk for a couple minutes.
Okay,
here.
So I'm gonna let everyone know I'm gonna put up a slide for our next training, which is this Friday on the child tax credit and stimulus checks. And I also wanted to let you know that a survey will be coming out about this presentation. We would really appreciate it if you can fill that out for us. That would be great. So one of the questions we have is, I've been looking to move myself and I have a lot of rental property postings online that say no felonies. Are landlords allowed to state that in a posting?
That's something that we are increasingly seeing successfully challenged. So the guidance from HUD says that those types of bans are more likely to be challenged as discriminatory now. So I think that would certainly be something that a local fair housing center could follow up on to see what do they mean about exactly that. You know, what is their policy, if any? How are they treating people? I think that would really invite some further investigation. You know, would they treat a white applicant and a black applicant with similar criminal backgrounds equally when they were contacted?
Okay, the next one we have, I think, is when you were talking about the 2 heartbeats per room stuff. Someone is asking, how can local code trump federal law on occupancy?
There is not a federal law on occupancy. So the familial status protections and the guidance from HUD say really utilize local code. If there isn't any existing, especially in the smaller communities, they maybe don't have anything about, you know, how many people can rent or live together safely. The default is the International Property Maintenance Code. So HUD at the federal level has defaulted to the local municipalities to encourage housing providers to follow what guidance exists at the local level, if any. So it's a federally protected class of people that kind of ties together closely with what the local municipality has set forth as how many people can live together safely in their community. So hopefully that answers that question.
All right. Someone is asking if a landlord can deny housing because a couple is applying.
In Michigan, marital status protections exist, so I think that would warrant further investigation as well. I'm wondering if this is, maybe they're applying in a program. Something we haven't talked about is shared living and kind of roommates. There are some very small exemptions there that are related to gender, but I would really want to know why couples are not considered. Sometimes we see that in like student housing, for example, and we default back on how many people can legally live here. And if it measures for 2 people, then they should be allowed. Students with a child, student with a spouse, things along those lines. I think that would benefit from further investigation.
Okay, next one we have, you got like 3 more minutes, is that although there is protection for voucher as payment, how is the landlord able to still discriminate against their normal standards of making 2.5 times or 3 times their rental rate? So saying that they can't deny someone because they have an HCV, but then as part of their policies,
So
you have to have this income.
Yeah, the HCV is not an automatic approval. It's that the income should be counted towards household income to see if the household qualifies towards the existing standard. So hopefully that helps differentiate. Just because I have a voucher doesn't mean you absolutely have to rent to me. It means I have this income that should be counted as such towards the household income, towards the standards the provider has set forth for that housing opportunity. So it's a small but important distinction there that I hope helps.
Okay, so this will be our last question. So sorry if we didn't get to yours. Hot topic. Are there protections for people with past evictions or past judgments that are over 5 years old? This is with the assumption that they have paid the debt and do not owe any landlords.
I think very minimal. I believe. No, I think I'm mistaken. I was going to say, I know Ann Arbor has just put forward some new information about criminal background history at their local level, but I don't know that any community has added rental history necessarily. So I think from a fair housing perspective, we would say, what is their policy in regards to that type of history? And are they applying that screening standard equally across all protected classes? But I'm not familiar with offhand. And if anybody does know of a community that has successfully put that standard forward, please put it in the chat. But offhand, I don't know of a ordinance that is really addressing that specifically at this time.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Liz, for giving us some of your extra time and your expertise.
Thank you all.
Great conversation today. And as a reminder, you will be emailed this webinar, and they're all posted on Micah's YouTube page. So we hope to see you Friday at our next webinar, but have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.